a much better scenario than the unstoppable chain reaction of traditional reactors.
Oh, good lord. No, it is not unstoppable. Today we're going to be looking at one of ColdFusion's videos. Specifically, this will change everything, how China won the thorium nuclear energy race. Not sure what race they're referring to, because there are no active thorium reactors that are producing electricity on the grid. And this thumbnail is a picture of an artist's rendition of a tokamak, a type of fusion reactor. So, not sure what's going on here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tyler Folse. I'm a nuclear engineer with a little over 10 years of experience in the commercial nuclear power industry. From engineering to operations to emergency response. I don't claim to know everything there is nuclear, but I can certainly share some knowledge. Let's see.
Hi, welcome to another episode of ColdFusion. In the quiet deserts of China's Gansu province, something extraordinary just happened. What's claimed to be the world's first operational thorium reactor has come to life. And what makes this extra remarkable is that they did it.
Okay, I've heard of this one. That's a 2 megawatt thermal research reactor. So, compared to the nuclear power plant that I worked at, which was close to 4,000 megawatts thermal, that's not exactly a lot of energy. I mean, it's a step along the way, but I'm not sure what's groundbreaking.
All using declassified American research, it's an incredible story. For decades, thorium has been whispered about as the holy grail of nuclear energy. It's meant to be cleaner, safer, and almost impossible to weaponize.
Cleaner. Yes, it produces less transuranic elements. So overall, the waste is less dense in terms of the radioactivity of spent fuel. That's true. However, if you're talking in terms of emissions, in terms of manufacturing, it's about the same as a uranium-based nuclear reactor. It's not safer. First off, the thorium itself isn't your active ingredient. It absorbs a neutron, becomes thorium-232 absorbs a neutron, comes thorium-233, a couple of beta decays later, you have uranium-233. So you're actually still using uranium here. And safety depends on reactor design, not the fuel type. And many thorium reactors are indeed breeders. They require higher neutron flux and carry risks just like any other advanced system. So again, we're talking comparable. Do I think they're safe? Yes, they're as safe as a conventional uranium nuclear reactor, which is still pretty safe. And not weaponizable. It's not impossible to make a weapon from a thorium reactor. Uranium-233 can be used to make a weapon, but it's not practical. It's also not practical to use spent fuel from a conventional nuclear reactor to make a weapon. This is actually more contaminated with uranium-232, which is more of a gamma emission. So this part of the waste is actually more challenging than a uranium-235-based conventional reactor. So again, we're talking about a wash compared to conventional technology.
In fact, 5 years ago, on this very channel, I explored the theory of thorium in one of my videos. But today, it's a reality. But this isn't just...
Okay, I haven't seen that video, but the theory of thorium, we're not talking scientific theory at this point. We're talking about the idea of using it to produce electricity.
A scientific milestone. It's a glimpse into a future where energy innovation isn't driven by profit.
So where it said operational, it is an operational reactor, but it's not. But it's an operational research reactor. Not to dismiss the technology, but call me when they have some. Call me when they're producing some on the grid, because there's additional challenges with producing power at scale, making electricity. You need to have your support systems, but essentially you have a boiler, not a power plant.
But by public investment. And it shows what happens when we decide to bet on long-term research for a payoff in the order of half a century. In this episode, we dig deep into the big picture of a better, safer nuclear energy called thorium reactors. We'll also try to separate the hype from the reality.
And believe me, I'll be fact-checking all of that, because it sounds like hype, because it's really not. No, don't get the wrong idea. I am pro-thorium reactors. I also think they're highly overrated, and they will complement, not replace, uranium-based reactors. And note that I'm saying thorium and uranium when I'm referring to thorium being the ingredient that turns into uranium-233, versus uranium-235. So ultimately, saying thorium reactor is a little bit misleading, but for the purpose of avoiding confusion, just like this video does just like I think this video will do, I'll say thorium when I'm referring to fission using uranium-233 spawned from thorium, as opposed to uranium-235 used in a typical reactor that you see all over the world operating today.
If the Chinese test proves successful and scalable, could this prove to be a turning point in the history of energy production? Or is it not all it's cracked up to be? Let's take a look.
Those balls are kind of fun. I mean, thorium, like uranium, is just, a shiny metal.
You are watching ColdFusion TV.
I wonder what their thoughts on actual cold fusion are. That's a whole topic for another video, but I'll pin that in the comments if you want to hear my take on it.
5,000 tons of thorium would supply the planet with all of its energy for a year. So your one mine would bring up enough thorium without even trying to power the entire planet.
It's found in tailings piles. It's found in ash piles.
We could use thorium about 200 times more efficiently than we're using uranium now. This reduces the waste generated over uranium by factors of hundreds and by factors of millions over fossil fuels.
So it will reduce waste, but not zero. And it's exciting for the idea of using thorium, but it still does produce some long-lived fission products. And handling of uranium-233 and the protactinium-233, the intermediate step between thorium-233 and uranium-233, does create reprocessing complexity and new types of waste streams. So there's new types of waste that isn't really produced very much for uranium-235 based reactors that will be produced here. The point is, no reactor type, and I'm going to add no energy generation type, eliminates the need for waste management. I mean, fossil fuels have carbon emissions. Wind and solar, they just have a short lifespan, and materials used in manufacturing those aren't exactly made for long-term sustainability. I'm not saying we should move away from wind and solar either. I'm just saying every source of energy has their drawbacks. And I want to see more thorium, but I'm tired of people acting like it's the end-all be-all energy source, because let's face it, there isn't one. Now, it would be good because it would diversify nuclear energy's portfolio.
But before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. ColdFusion episodes are now available on Spotify, so we've had to burn fossil fuel. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've had to burn fossil fuels to turn on our lights, cook our food, and power our lives. It works, but the downside is serious air pollution, billions of dollars in healthcare expenses, and millions of preventable deaths.
Both thorium reactors and uranium reactors are emission-free when it comes to generation. Now, when it comes to construction, because they require materials to build that come from factories that rely heavily on fossil fuels involved in their value stream, that's where emissions come in when you look at levelized cost of energy. Same is true for wind and solar. But even if you take that into consideration, the cost per megawatt, we're talking far less with nuclear in general than coal, natural gas, biomass.
And then in the wake of World War II came the nuclear age. Nuclear power was different. It was amazingly efficient and seemed like the future. But over time, there were problems with its public image and fears of nuclear disaster.
That's a shame. Public image killed nuclear advancement, and there were some economic issues, but really the PR failure is the biggest one, which is a shame.
Enter thorium. Thorium appears to be the perfect solution. It's abundant, it's less volatile, and less reactive than uranium.
Yes, thorium itself is, because thorium itself isn't actually what you're fissioning. The uranium-233 actually releases more energy than uranium-235. That's a good thing. That means that you're going to produce more energy, but the term less volatile, I do not agree with. Reactivity's up, so in a way, you can actually be more efficient with that. The problem is thorium doesn't work by itself. And the other thing, you don't have to have all thorium or all uranium-235. You can have a mixed fuel group, so the uranium-235 starts some fissions, the thorium-232 absorbs some neutrons, a couple of beta decays later, hey, you have some uranium-233, so you're effectively using both. This already happens in conventional nuclear reactors, with the exception just with different materials, because conventional nuclear reactors use uranium-235 with uranium-238. The 235 is fissile and produces your energy, but uranium-238 does not counting a few fast neutrons that are few and far between. But uranium-238 absorbs a neutron, becomes uranium-239. A couple of beta decays later, you have plutonium-239, which is fissile and is more reactive. So towards the later on in core life, you're actually making a little bit more energy for your given amount of fuel. You still stay at 100% power, but little changes in reactivity are faster because the plutonium-239 is a little bit more reactive. So as far as a concept, yeah, it's been around.
And a nuclear plant powered by thorium can't suffer from a nuclear meltdown.
No. So, again, the fuel type's got nothing to do with it. We're talking about nuclear design characteristics. What a lot of people get confused is this is referring to molten salt reactors. I mean, after all, they're already melted down. You can't be more pulled over than already pulled over, right? But seriously, molten salt designs are passively safe and can drain into cooling tanks. So it's a design feature, not a fuel feature. You can have that with thorium fuel, with mixed fuel, with uranium fuel. Solid-fueled thorium reactors are just as meltable as the uranium ones if cooling is lost. Safety comes from redundancy, passive decay heat removal, and negative reactivity feedback with thorium and uranium. Thorium isn't some sort of magical unobtainium. It's still a metal that can melt under extreme conditions.
In the Chinese reactor, for instance, if things do get out of hand,
that's because they're showing the molten salt part. You can have this with uranium too. It's got nothing to do with it being thorium.
Plug at the bottom of the reactor melts automatically.
Yep.
The fuel then simply drains out using gravity.
That is an example of a passive safety system. It uses gravity. Gravity can't fail. At least I've yet to see it fail. But yes, it's because of this passive safety system, not because of thorium.
A much better scenario than the unstoppable chain reaction of traditional reactors.
Oh, good lord. No, it is not unstoppable. Control rods stop the reaction. You do an emergency shutdown, it stops the reaction in about 2 seconds. And even if an operator doesn't manually do it, there are so many built-in safety functions that trigger this stop. Reactor trip or reactor scram, it's all the same thing. The point is all the control rods fall in about 2 seconds. And there it shuts down the reactor. It shuts down the reaction, mission accomplished.
For added context, to give you a picture of just how efficient thorium reactors are, just look at this chart. It shows the ratio of energy.
This is for molten salt reactors, not thorium reactors. And this is an estimated return on investment. Molten salt is new technology, and here, I don't know this exact source, but I'm willing to bet we're talking operating costs, not costs of constructing the more complicated piping systems you would need for a molten salt reactor, as well as the chemical plant you'd have to put next door to make all of your molten salt. Again, not saying we shouldn't do it, but you need to pay attention to what goes into these things.
Out to energy in. The purple bar is a thorium molten salt reactor, and the blue bar next to it is a traditional nuclear reactor.
You can have thorium light water reactors too, and you can have uranium molten salt reactors. And you can even have hybrids, mixed fuel in either design. And also that's just light water reactors.
If thorium is proved successful, it's clear to see why it's world-changing stuff, especially when compared to any previous form of energy production. Despite
what would be world-changing is if we all embrace nuclear power in general, both uranium and thorium. Because those are all, I agree, in the same, since you compared it to wind, solar, and fossil fuels, then sure. Ultimately, that's what you got to do.
Thorium's immense potential compared to hundreds of uranium-based nuclear reactors.
And that looks like a Mr. Clean magic eraser.
They remain as mythical as a unicorn. There's only one operational thorium reactor, and it's hidden away in the Gobi Desert.
And by operational, I mean they're using it for research, not generating electricity.
China may possess the world's sole reactor, but the twist is, it was built on American research.
We're all at Oak Ridge. The morning that we showed up, one of the Oak Ridge guys came in with an announcement from the Chinese Academy of Science. We are going to do this, we're going to own the IP. So you would think someone in our government would say, maybe you shouldn't keep giving away this
Yeah,
information.
that's a little
The
sketch.
Chinese achievement was announced by head of the Thorium reactor project, Zhu Hongxie, during a closed-door meeting at the Chinese Academy of Science. He stated, quote, "The US left its research publicly available, waiting for the right successor. We were that successor. We mastered every technique in the literature, then pushed it further. We are now at the frontier of global nuclear innovation." End quote.
So it's exciting that they're making something out of this. I mean, say what you will about leaving stuff available for the Chinese to take it from the Americans. I mean, hey. But it's a research step, not a technology domination here. And you could argue that it's still behind Oak Ridge with the molten salt reactor experiment that was done back in the 1960s. Now, granted, I like the idea of this is a renaissance, if you will, of rediscovering old technology, but I don't agree with that statement.
So okay, let's back up a bit and learn what a thorium reactor actually is.
Let's see here.
Firstly, thorium is a naturally occurring element found in rock deposits. It serves as the fuel for the reactor. When thorium is hit with neutrons,
Just like uranium,
it absorbs
found in rock deposits. I mean, you mine it.
instead of splitting, eventually turning into a fissile material, uranium-233.
They skipped a couple of beta decays, but sure, maybe they're just trying to explain it fast. But yeah, thorium-232 doesn't magically absorb a neutron and become uranium-233 without a couple of intermediate steps, but I won't harp on that too much.
A fissile material is one that splits apart when neutrons are blasted at the atoms. When this happens,
Specifically thermal neutrons, it is actually possible for uranium-238 to fission, but it involves fast neutrons, and the probability still isn't great.
energy is released that can then be converted into electricity, usually by heating steam and driving a turbine.
Yes.
Unlike uranium, the naturally occurring thorium-232 is not fissile, meaning it cannot sustain a nuclear reaction on its own.
Yes.
However, it is fertile, so it can be transformed into a fissile material, but it needs a helping hand getting there. For thorium to become a useful fuel source, it first has to be blasted with neutrons, turning it into thorium-233, which beta decays into protactinium.
Which is why you're going to need uranium, or plutonium for that matter, something fissile to act as your neutron source to produce it at scale. So that's the other myth, that thorium will fission by itself, which it will not, and will not need uranium. You need uranium in your thorium reactors and to start your reaction.
233. The protactinium can be extracted, which decays into uranium-233, a usable fuel.
Okay, there you go.
There
They
really
showed it.
were three options for nuclear energy at the dawn of the nuclear era. There was uranium-235, which was the fissile form of uranium. This was the form of uranium that could actually be utilized directly in a nuclear reactor. Most of the uranium was uranium-238. This had to be transformed into another nuclear fuel called plutonium before it could be used. And then there was thorium. And in a similar manner to uranium-238, it also had to be transformed into another nuclear fuel, uranium-233, before it could be used in a reactor.
Now this process does
Now, you could even use the uranium-238, 235 natural mix. Can-do reactors use them, but they use a stronger moderator, heavy water, that's uses deuterium instead of hydrogen-1, because it needs that, because the odds just simply aren't there with just light water for using uranium.
work well with traditional nuclear reactors because they use solid fuel rods and pressurized water cooling. It's much harder to extract things mid-reaction when fuel is in solid form.
That's
Enter
true.
molten salt reactors.
The molten salt
But not impossible.
fuel for this reactor is
Oh, here we
radically
go. This is direct footage from the Oak Ridge experiment.
different from that used in solid fuel reactors. Here, salt flows from a pipe which is heated to keep the salt molten. At 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, the salt does not react with air. It flows like water, but does not boil.
To recap, molten salt reactors use liquid fuel, which makes it much easier to isolate protactinium and continue the thorium fuel
That's the
cycle.
advantage.
If done right, molten salt reactors can be way safer than the standard water-cooled reactors. The
Keyword, if done right. I mean, that's true. But done right involves having robust safety systems. I would argue that doing light water reactors right puts them in the same tier of safety.
Latter of which must be kept under insanely high pressures to stop the water from boiling away. Molten salt reactors.
Yeah, in pressurized water reactors. There's also boiling water reactors. There's also gas-cooled reactors.
Operate at low pressure, and as mentioned, are set up in a way
low pressure but high temperature. Point is, you got to get that energy somewhere if you're going to produce things at scale. The temperature of these molten salt reactors are higher than that of light water reactors.
that in the case of an emergency, the fuel is automatically drained away, avoiding the chance of this happening.
It was the first step in a nuclear nightmare. As far as we know at this hour, no worse than that. But a government official said that a breakdown in an atomic power plant in Pennsylvania today is probably the worst nuclear reactor accident to date.
Keep in mind this was before Chernobyl and it was contained. Limited radiological release. The biggest casualty was the PR outfall from this. Even though fission products were secure, containment worked. Meaning this was bad. This reshaped the industry. They added additional safety systems, both in retrofits and in new builds within the US. It was expensive, it scared a lot of people, but it didn't hurt anyone, at least not directly.
There was no apparent serious contamination of workers, but a nuclear safety group said that radiation inside the plant is at 8 times the deadly level, so strong that after passing...
Inside the plant, all right, so they need to be clear. Inside the containment building. As in not where they let people in. So not like outside here at the guard shack or by the cooling towers or anything like that. Another example of bad PR.
Through a 3-foot thick concrete wall, it can be measured a mile away.
But it can be measured, but it's not at deadly doses.
Worst was yet to come. The earthquake created a power blackout at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. The emergency generators started but did not run for long.
So this was an example of a beyond design basis accident with Fukushima, and it was bad but not Chernobyl bad.
The cooling pumps did not restart, and about 45 minutes later, the tsunami reached the nuclear plant. The entire nuclear plant quickly became out of control.
That was due to hydrogen buildup.
Starting March 12, 2011, one of the 6 reactor units exploded, followed not long after by 2 others, releasing an unprecedented amount of nuclear radiation into the air.
No, not unprecedented. It wasn't nearly as much as Chernobyl. And some reasons for that is the reactors already safely shut down, and they were allowed to decay. Chernobyl was operating and they went prompt critical, which is why the radioactive release was so much worse. What makes thorium special? It turns into uranium-233.
Despite not being a ready-to-use fuel and requiring complex processing, if done right, thorium could be a superior alternative to uranium for 4 reasons. Number 1, it's abundant.
That's true. It is naturally abundant, by a factor of 3.
Thorium is everywhere. It's in the Earth's crust, in rocks, and it's at least 3 times more abundant than uranium. In China alone...
You can even extrapolate that if you look underwater for both uranium and thorium, but right now there's not enough nuclear plants that anyone's seriously considering it to be worth that, because there's really so much uranium and thorium that's available, not underwater.
There's enough thorium reserves to power the country's energy needs for the next 20,000 years. Number 2, it's safer.
It's not safer. Better nuclear plant designs are safer, but that doesn't have to involve thorium.
As I mentioned earlier, thorium itself isn't fissile. And while that sounds like a downside, it can actually be a good thing. It grants more control over the reaction. Some pro-thorium advocates also...
No, it really does not. It's going to involve the similar control systems, such as control rods and negative reactivity coefficients. No, it's no more controllable. In fact, if you're having to control things like liquid metals, that could actually make it more complex. Not harder, not less safe, but more complex. And the point is, it's just how you engineer the thing.
Also emphasize that thorium is, quote, proliferation resistant.
That's because it produces harmful byproducts that are more close to the things that you need to get your hands on. I would argue that uranium has the similar thing.
Meaning that you can't easily make bombs with it. But
you can't easily make bombs from uranium or plutonium either.
Others say that these safety claims are exaggerated, just as the risks of nuclear reactors are. But also, because of the reactor design, the use of molten salt as a coolant eliminates the need for high-pressure water systems like traditional designs, reducing the risk of accidents like a steam explosion. Number 3, it's clean.
Yeah, you won't have to worry about steam explosions because you don't use as much steam in the primary systems. You are going to have to worry about molten salt leaks, though. So it's just different stuff you need to design about.
No. Thorium reactors also don't emit greenhouse gases, and unlike uranium waste, which remains hazardous for tens of thousands of years.
Another example of these fake barrels. That is not where high-level nuclear waste goes. They are not in barrels. They are in massive dry cask storage after being stored in spent fuel pools. So, yeah, that's fake stuff.
Thorium waste becomes safe in just a few hundred years.
They actually overestimated. Now, safe, when they say safe, I think they mean close to zero. It's going to be above background radiation, uranium, for tens of thousands of years. But as far as safe levels, uranium is going to be at acceptable levels after about 500 years, and thorium more like 100. So yes, thorium is better, but a lot of people exaggerate how long it is for both.
In the case of China, obtaining thorium could come at almost zero effort. Surprisingly, thorium is actually a waste product of its rare earth mining industry.
We can power our civilization on thorium without opening a single thorium mine. It is already a plentiful byproduct of...
Yeah, they do a lot of crazy mining over there, so that's good that they can use some of it. They just have to separate it, which isn't no effort, but it's good that it's accessible.
Existing mining operations.
Number 4. It's efficient. Thorium generates up to 200 times more energy than uranium. To put it into context, just say you have...
No, not 200. I don't buy that. Let me see where they're getting their information from.
2 batteries. One is uranium and one thorium. If the uranium battery gives you 1 day of power, a thorium battery of the same size would power you for 6.5 months.
Okay, yes, we can multiply by 200, but, alright, I'm not sure where they're getting this number from. If they're talking uranium-233 versus uranium-235, it's a little more, but...
Despite all of this, molten salt reactors have largely been stuck in the experimental phase for decades.
So why aren't we working on liquid fuel in the United States in general?
Oh, licensing. Licensing a liquid fuel reactor, commercial especially, in the US right now is scary.
Yeah, there's a lot of regulatory hurdles with new technology. And part of it is it just doesn't have the industry maturity. So it's the second mover bias. More like fourth or fifth.
Nuclear status quo remained unchallenged, not even after countless reactor meltdowns. No one's made any moves to put the molten...
Countless reactor meltdowns, come on. Also, this looks like an explosion at... Also, this isn't a nuclear plant. The significant ones that involved melting that involved energy production reactions were 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl. Were there others? Yes. There were others that happened in the experimental stage, but not countless. I had a class where we studied every single nuclear accident. It's one of the things that's required to get your license when operating a nuclear power plant in the United States. The class was a little over an hour, and it included criticality accidents in addition, which didn't involve anything melting.
Salt reactor theory into practice, until now. Over in China, Xu and his team developed the reactor technology from American declassified research of the 1960s. The US was testing this very same technology, but chose not to develop it further. Instead, they focused on uranium-fueled pressurized water reactor technology. That 1960s research...
In that time period, your goal was, let's make some electricity, but let's also make some weapons. And in the thorium stream, the slightly less proliferation is seen as a disadvantage back then.
Was known as Oak Ridge. It was the closest America came to thorium power. But why did they stop? We'll look into that now.
To make things that blow
NRC
up.
regulations specifically spell out prohibitions against fluid-filled reactors. You cannot operate fluid-filled reactor more than 1 megawatt without expensive license process.
After the Hiroshima bomb tipped the scales of power in America's favor, the US was keen to develop more nuclear weapons. Much of that work happened at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee. Director Alvin Weinberg also began looking into alternative, less weaponizable nuclear methods. Thorium-fueled molten salt reactors were what he settled on. The molten salt reactor experiment ran from 1965 to 1969. The results were incredibly promising. It quickly became the holy grail of thorium research. As the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists states, quote, "All molten salt reactors are based in one way or another on the molten salt reactor experiment that operated at Oak Ridge from 1965 to 1969. End quote.
Build off existing technology, why not?
Following the vision of Alvin Weinberg, he was the director of Oak Ridge National Labs from the 50s to the 1970s, and he had a vision of how we could use thorium to advance beyond the current constraints of our society in terms of fossil fuels, hydropower, and existing nuclear technology. One of the amazing parts about his vision was how this could transform not only the US economy, but many other places in the world, some of which don't have the resources that we have in terms of fresh water or arable land. This is a vision he had of how thorium reactors could be used to desalinate water, grow crops in desert areas.
Oh, so I didn't realize he even looked at the extracting thorium from seawater portion if he's talking about that part of ocean. That's interesting.
Really, truly change the economic balance of the world.
But then, the experiment was shut down. In his book, Alvin Weinberg questioned, quote, "Why didn't the molten salt system, so elegant and so well thought out, prevail? There were no technical reasons why the molten salt reactor was not pursued." End quote. For one.
So putting aside the political Cold War, let's make weapons too argument, there were still some engineering channels that remained unsolved. Fuel separation, the Protactinium-233, doing that in real time was still more challenging. Corrosion control using liquid high-temp salts going to degrade over time. Graphite moderation, which they had back then, also degrades. And everything being radioactive liquid, 600 plus Celsius, maintenance is a problem. They didn't have the remote handling tech, the radiation hardened materials, and off-gas cleaning systems. And there was no large-scale industrial roadmap to back that up. So it wasn't all bombs, but that was some of them.
During the Cold War, uranium fever was at an all-time high. The Pentagon needed faster breeder reactors that could fuel the nuclear arms race. In short, nobody cared that thorium was safer.
So those aren't really breeder in the sense of where you're breeding your own fuel. It's more of you're making plutonium to make weapons at the same time.
Or that it wasn't suitable for weaponry. That somewhat defeated the point.
Weinberg's vision, on the other hand, was brought to an end in the early 1970s. And I think this was a very sad moment in the history of our country and probably in the history of the world, because an entire direction.
Yeah, because we could have invested in that stuff back then and it still would have been technology that wasn't there in the 1970s, but it probably could have been here by now with investment in the required support systems using liquid metal technology.
Of potential development was being ended at that moment by a not well thought out comment by Congressman Holyfield, who was very powerful. So Weinberg's pursuit of thorium appears to have had a great deal to do with why he was fired from his position.
Coming back with what will be built, again, it's light water reactors. I don't understand what's going on here. Why are we spending money to build reactors based on the same concept that we have been building ever since World War II?
It wasn't all about politics, though. According to Alvin, in the 1950s and 60s, nuclear power was dominated by physicists who thought in terms of solid fuel pins, reactor physics, and neutron behavior. All the while, the key to safer nuclear power lay in chemistry. Quote,
"So, I can't speak for what people thought in physicists and universities back then, but everyone, at least from before I went to college to after that, are talking about the same sort of thorium technology all the time. Differences in different fuel types, different reactor types, but just not being there. And with fusion as well. It's actually kind of sad the more I think about it. One of the reasons why I didn't get into research, I wanted to get into operations.
Our problem is not that the idea is poor, it's that it's different from the mainstream and too chemical to be fully appreciated by non-chemists." End quote.
You can teach it,
We'll
though.
look at the
I mean, these are nuclear engineers we're talking about. Chemistry is really part of it.
Points to what Alvin is saying in the last section of this episode. But for now, let's see what happens next.
That's a shame.
So, the Oak Ridge experiment was defunded, Alvin was reassigned, and the thorium blueprints gathered dust. That was until the 2000s. At that time, NASA engineer Kirk Sorensen was researching ways to power a community on the moon. Kirk stumbled across Oak Ridge's research on molten salt reactors and thorium, and he was mesmerized by thorium's energy density. It was so high that you could theoretically hold a lifetime's worth of energy in your hand, and it was abundant on both the Earth and on...
You can do that with uranium too, depending on what you mean by lifetime, like all you would need to power your household. But yeah, I just still look back and mesmerize with nuclear energy in general is ultra energy dense.
The moon. Kirk got to work to get the message out about thorium. He was convinced that if the United States hadn't abandoned thorium research, the country could have been energy independent by the early 2000s. But alas, his thorium enthusiasm fell on deaf ears. But here, the story takes a major turn. While
That would also involve mass electric car usage if you're including that.
seemingly everyone was ignoring what he had to say, one country did notice the potential. China. There were thousands of reports sitting there in public archives with insights that could shape the next generation of energy, and the Chinese researchers realized that a thorium-fueled molten salt reactor could solve their growing energy needs, and also secure their national interests. In 2009, China's thorium...
Keep in mind that those images they showed was a typical refueling cavity using water. None of that was molten salt.
Project formally took shape. Construction began in 2018. There were hundreds of scientists who worked day and night for years, dissecting declassified American documents.
They're showing pictures of a reactor that uses water.
Replicating experiments and designing new materials, and many of them were on site for more than 300 days per year. Project lead Zhu would summarize the situation by saying, quote, "Rabbits sometimes make mistakes and grow lazy. That's when the tortoise seizes its chance."
Wow.
And seized the chance they did. In 2023, China's thorium molten salt reactor achieved a sustained nuclear chain reaction, and by June of 2024, the reactor was operational.
It's amazing. So 60-year time skip, and they're just at roughly similar levels as Oak Ridge. I'd say still a few years behind because of how long that one operated. All right, here's hype.
And now we come to the reality check. We may be closer than ever before to a thorium-powered future, but there are still many things to consider.
I would argue we were closer in the 1960s before it was shut down hard.
Contrary to popular belief, there have been a number of commercial thorium plants in the past, and that's since the late 40s in Germany, India, the Netherlands, and the US. But none of them survived past the 1980s. Well, why is that? Some plants did have design problems, but there's more to it. It turns out that the process of extracting thorium from ore and converting it into a fertile fuel for nuclear purposes was a lot more expensive than doing the same thing for uranium. The pessimist view is that economics killed thorium, and nothing else. As mentioned,
Not nothing else, but yeah.
Thorium can produce 200 times the energy of the equivalent uranium.
No, it can't. I don't know where they're getting that number from. Best I can guess is the relative abundance of thorium-232 numbers versus the natural abundance of uranium-235 sitting with uranium-238. So you're assuming you get 100% out of your thorium-232 conversion into uranium-233. Total fuel utilization. That's gotta be what they think they're getting from that. No. It's similar energy per fission, and thorium has to be breeded to uranium-233. I don't know what those exact numbers are, but it's not the 200.
But this requires the reprocessing of the fuel. You can't just run the plant and burn up all the thorium. And that's because as the plant would keep running, at some point, the accumulation of waste products affects the operation of a thorium core. And as you guessed,
it's possible to design it where you can refuel it online, but ultimately you need to shut the plant down anyway, because you're going to have to do maintenance on the non-nuclear systems, you know, the steam turbine, the part that makes the electricity. You need to take generators, feed water heaters offline and replace them every now and then.
To keep this up and keep the plant running long term is expensive. And another clarification.
Outages are going to be longer. It's possible they'll be less frequent than 18 to 24 months, but they're going to be longer.
People do say that the reason that thorium hasn't caught on was that it can't be used for weapons. But it's more along the lines that it's more expensive to use it as a weapon, which is a good thing in the end, I guess. And then there's the problem of materials science. For molten salt reactors,
that wasn't a bad debunker D-hop on their part.
The salt is extremely hot and ends up being corrosive to its surroundings. Materials that can survive this long term are hard to come by, but the Chinese seem to be working on the issue. They've built a custom alloy called Haseloy N. So let's say that thorium can do what the thorium proponents say it can. Nations could power entire cities. There'd literally be no need for fossil fuels, expensive and short-lived wind turbines.
You'd have to electrify every single vehicle. Not impossible, but it's going to take a complete infrastructural revamp rather than just power generation.
Or even solar panels that degrade over time.
That they do.
Plus, since molten salt reactors don't need water cooling, they could run in deserts, or even space.
Thorium is also common on the moon and easy to find. Here's an actual map of where the lunar thorium is located.
Nice. You can get thorium, and you can also get some helium-3 in the regolith while you're up there, so you can go ahead and have some fusion. Let's go ahead and throw some of that in while we're at it.
Thorium has an electromagnetic signature that makes it easy to find even from a spacecraft. With the
Don't
energy
get me started on helium-3 fusion, by the way.
generated from a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, we can recycle all of the air, water, and waste products within the lunar community. In fact, doing so would be an absolute requirement for success.
Thorium critics say that a lot of the promising claims are oversimplified, and the road to thorium will be a real long slug. China has made some serious...
Maybe I'm one of those people, but I'm going to say, I mean, it involves that with any sort of developing new technology. Again, I would still like to see it happen.
moves, but it's still early days. Case in point, the Chinese test reactor is actually tiny, and it's not a full-fledged power plant. It's rated for 2 megawatts of heat. For context, MIT's research reactor on campus, a regular nuclear reactor, although the biggest campus reactor in the US, is 3 times that size.
Research reactors are toys. I essentially played on one as part of getting my my license to operate the big one.
But there's also plans for a 60 megawatt Chinese reactor to be operational by 2030. The Chinese scientists pulled off a world first.
And again, the footage that he's showing are not of thorium reactors. This is also a research reactor that uses uranium fuel.
They added fresh fuel to the thorium reactor while it was running. That proved that continuous operation is possible. And
these are all pulse type reactors that are used in research, mainly because, hey, you pull some control rods and then you have a nice blue prompt critical flash. Prompt critical being safe and controlled in this type of reactor. Do not do that with a commercial reactor, lest you have yourself another Chernobyl. I mean, it's also basically impossible with modern designs, but still.
China may not be alone. Copenhagen Atomics plans to test a molten salt thorium reactor in Switzerland in
I did another video on their stuff. That was interesting.
2026. After this, they plan to mass manufacture them at scale. Other countries are moving, but at a slower pace. India, which has the world's largest thorium reserves, have been researching thorium for ages, but refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that slowed progress. There's multiple startups in the US that are trying to revive the molten salt reactor development. And there's other startups in other countries. But most of this development remains mostly on paper. But even if it is early days, it's encouraging that people are trying. The thorium story shows the power of public research and how past R&D can seed waves of innovation decades later. But it also shows how easily research momentum can stall.
So I'm glad they've kind of introduced the other side of this. This video is saying China won the nuclear energy race. If they did, the race wasn't particularly exciting because the race isn't to build a lab scale prototype. It's to 1, commercialize it, 2, regulate it, 3, fuel it and maintain it sustainably for the long term, and 4, to, if you're looking at it as a thorium versus uranium thing, to outcompete uranium, or at least add as a significant portion of market share, which is going to take mass production of them, massive learning curves, massive upscaling. You're going to need your 3,000, 4,000 megawatt reactors in addition to your small modular reactors using thorium. So nobody, including China, has achieved that. And I still think the closest our civilization has been was during the peak of the Oak Ridge experiments back in the 1960s. After all, that one was bigger. That one was over 7 megawatts thermal, which is still dinky, but a good bit bigger.
As Zhu Hongxie put it, quote, "To achieve something meaningful in this field, you must have perseverance and prepare to dedicate 20 to 30 years to one single pursuit," end quote. So, there's red-hot views on either side of the thorium debate. Is it the clean revolution of the future, or do we cut our potential losses and
No, I want it in there too, but please don't overrate it. Just say what it is.
Stick with what we know? That is the question. So I'd love to hear what...
Also, people love showing cooling towers. The nuclear plant that I worked at didn't actually have cooling towers. It just had a really, really big reservoir. You don't need cooling towers. You don't necessarily need a reservoir. You can pick one or the other or both, depending on your size and energy demand. They're also not unique to nuclear. I've seen cooling towers for coal and natural gas plants as well.
You guys think? These days, everyone is talking about fake, so I'd love to hear what you guys think.
Well, you've heard my spiel. Thanks so much for the recommendation, and thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.